Hello, and welcome to a special Games That Weren't feature, where today we're celebrating the major milestone of 25 years of Games That Weren't. And I'm absolutely staggered that I've managed to get this far and still be alive in some shape or form. Perhaps with a lot less hair than I did back then when I first started. And when I first started, I was just 16, 17 years old, and it just feels like it was yesterday, to be honest. It's gone so quick, which is very scary. So the point of this video is to kind of talk back and look at the last 25 years about how we first got started with the archive, and then some of the findings that we managed to find along the way, some of the key ones in particular. This is kind of like an accompaniment to the post that we've done on the website, which goes into a lot more detail. So we hope you enjoy it, and let's get cracking. So although the archive itself was born in 1999, my actual interest in unreleased games started much earlier in 1993, and this was thanks to Ian Osborne's wonderful article called That Was the Game That Wasn't, which was published in Commodore Force magazine. And the thing that captivated me the most was where some of the games that were featured included these wonderful screenshots and looked really good. But the fact there were screenshots in the article to me suggested that there might be something out there that I could actually get for myself and play. So I got in touch with various friends and colleagues back in the day, including Jason Kelk, and they surprised me a lot by coming back with discs with various different previews that had been featured in the actual article, but also other games that the article hadn't covered. So it became clear to me that there was potentially a lot more out there to discover. So I started to kind of go through various different magazines, and after a while it became very clear that the article would only merely scratch the surface. So I started collecting together as much as I possibly could. So after a few years, I had all this information gathered together, but nowhere to kind of share it with other people. This was like the days before the internet had really taken off. So at that point in time, I was writing for a fanzine called Commodore Zone, which was being ran by Jason McKenzie and Jason Kelk. And the magazine was kind of like fill-in for Commodore format that had recently closed its doors. And I was kind of writing articles every so often for the magazine and doing contributions. So I suggested doing a feature on unreleased games, which would be a follow-on to Ian's original article. So thinking of a name, my brother-in-law suggested Games That Weren't, and that kind of stuck. And I thought it was perfect overall. So I kind of went with that and did this follow-on article, which would run for about 5 or 6 issues overall. And it was the same kind of basis as Ian's original article. There'd be a title and a state of play at the end. So very much inspired by Ian's original article, and it was kind of like a spiritual sequel to what he had done. So this would, as I say, this ran for about 5 or 6 issues overall, and this would be from information that I gathered from various magazines and also from friends such as Jason at the time. At the very end, because there was kind of a large gap between every single issue, by the point I'd done the very last feature, the actual website itself was already up and running and had a number of findings already and people coming forward. So the last article was slightly different, where we kind of gave an update on some of the titles that had originally been covered in Ian's original article, but also giving an update on things that were coming soon, which were potentially lost and found. I mean, we're a little bit optimistic as some of the titles that we included still haven't yet been found, unfortunately. But overall, this was a really fun feature to write, and it was great to kind of share that information, but there was much, much more to come. So in 1999, the Games That Weren't archive was born. And this was basically stemmed from when I started going to college and I was doing an IT course and we were being taught how to do our own web pages in something really simple like Microsoft Word, where we created a page and saved it as a HTML file. So this kind of gave me the impetus to create my own website at home. So I started off doing a Commodore 64 website, which covered some of the games that I'd worked on back in the day. But then I saw it as an opportunity to also do an extension of the Commodore Zone feature and provide a place where you could actually go and download the games from the articles, but also other games that I'd managed to find over time as well. So it started off just as a very simple A to Z, which you can see here. So you would just go to the page, click download, and then play on an emulator. But very quickly, we decided to add reviews or entries for the games with actual text. So it's kind of became an extension of that feature. And it also managed to contain a lot of information that never got featured in Commodore Zone. Basically, we started to get people get in touch over email from all over the world who had seen the website, and even developers who had worked on some of the games and other games we'd not yet covered. And we started to rapidly update the page and add all of this new information. So very quickly, the website outgrew the original article it was based on and became its own separate entity. So the updates were coming thick and fast, and I was trying to keep up with things as best I could, but I was still quite young, and I was out clubbing and drinking. I was about to go to university. I'd meet my future wife, and then had the news that I was going to become a dad for the first time. So the website definitely had to go on the back burner as I focused on these other things that were going on. So I decided to try and hand things over to someone else to continue for a bit, but that didn't really kind of work out in the end. So essentially the website would become frozen in time for a period whilst I concentrated on other things. This kind of led to suggestions that I'd completely abandoned the website and I wasn't coming back to it anytime soon. So I had to go on the forums and explain what was going on, and that I did intend to come back and continue the archive because I loved it so much, and we were on the verge of finding some really big things overall as well. Thankfully, it wasn't too long until I started to get a bit more time again, and the dust finally began to settle. And it was around about 2003. Got to the summer holidays, and I had this whole long period of time. So we used to have quite a few months off. So I was able to kind of sit down some evenings and start finally getting a new template together to replace that old archaic design, and that's what you can see a glimpse of here. So this was launched in the August before I went back to university once again. So I was still at university. I was about to go into my final year. But I wanted to kind of get this done and out the way, and because the old website was looking really quite poor at that point. But before I disappeared, we had been finding a number of games such as Armalite 2, but it was after this launch that we actually started to make some really big recoveries. And some of those I'm going to kind of show you now and just quickly talk about. The first major finding that we would have since the relaunch would be Solar Jetman for the Commodore 64. So already we knew that a full game existed thanks to artist Hayden Dalton, but both Hayden and programmer John Buckley had both already said that they no longer had anything of the game. So imagine our surprise that when in late 2003, Hayden begins sorting out his house to move to America and finds a briefcase shoved behind an old radiator. In that briefcase, he finds a couple of discs labelled with Solar Jetman, so excitedly sends them over 2 games that weren't to try and see what's on them. I remember as clear as day loading up the disc for the first time and seeing that loading picture scroll up and Jeff Folin's wonderful music kick into action. And it was really magical. For years, I'd wanted to, ever since I'd learnt that it was a Solar Jetman game on the 64, I really, really wanted and dreamed about seeing it someday. Essentially because I loved the NES game so much and used to play it to death in Dixon's. So this was amazing to see running for the first time and being one of the first people to ever play it. The game was eventually released on the website during our Christmas update in 2003. So although people were excited by Solar Jetman and its release, it was Deadlock which would cause the most stir. And that was probably in part to the screenshots that were shown in Zap64 back in the day. And now you are finally able to see those screenshots in action and play the demos for yourself, thanks to programmer Dan Phillips. So Dan had very kindly provided a number of prototypes. So although we'd actually shown some of the game previously before going into hibernation, Dan still had to go through all the previews and extract out suitable ones for us to show on the website. Finally, we did that in Christmas 2003, and people loved seeing Rob Levy's graphics in action for the first time and also exploring some of the large maps. Now, both Rob and Dan will say and confirm that, unfortunately, although the game looks amazing, the gameplay wasn't really there and it really needed a lot of work in that area. But you can't deny how amazing everything looks and feels as you play the demos. And also, when you look at it, it looks like a version of Super Metroid, and some years before Super Metroid was a thing on the Super Nintendo. And for an 8-bit C64, that is quite impressive. Then in 2004, another major recovery was made in the shape of Firebird's Tiger, which had been missing for many years by this point. Many of you remember the screenshots that were shown in adverts and various previews, including in Zap64, showcasing Paul Doherty's amazing looking artwork. The game itself was developed by Gary Liddon, who worked at Zap64 as a staff writer, and the game had hit various development issues over the years, before eventually, when Firebird changed over to Microprose, the game was fully cancelled. Thankfully, Gary had passed on all of the PDS source code to Jason Kelk, who then eventually passed all of that over to Games That Weren't to have a look and evaluate. It would be Henrik and Janny who would very carefully piece together the preview that you can see running here, and they constructed various different levels that existed within the game. Unfortunately, they're not particularly playable. There is no real enemy interaction, but you have a main character that you can move around the map and do some basic interactions. It's mainly just a glimpse of what could have been, and it does look amazing. It's a shame that things didn't get any further. By 2005, I was now working full-time as a web developer, and it was at this stage as well that we started to get a bit of media attention as various publications started to pop up covering old games. And one of the first to do this was Games TM, where they had a section called Unsung Heroes that spoke to us about the archive as a whole. But then we also did a feature for Retrogame Magazine, a magazine that had just come out about a year before. And it was from that article that editor Martin Carroll suggested about doing a regular Games That Weren't feature based on the website. So the idea would be that we would cover about 3 or 4 titles across multiple different platforms. So here we can see an excerpt from the first article that was ever published. So the first game we ever looked at was Flood 2, and included input thanks to Paul Hughes and Mark Jones, including some sketches. And then we also took a look at Scooby-Doo and the Castle Mystery, which was a kind of a commonly known unreleased game, but also Motor X as well, which was the first time the game had ever been really revealed publicly. Then there was also a small little segment about Lunar Jetman, and it mentions about there being footage on a cover disc. And that was the wonderful thing about Retro Gamers, that at the beginning they used to have a DVD on as a cover mount, so we could put additional extras on that DVD. So I used to do little video clips of some of the games and find other assets, and there'd be a little folder made up where you could get some extras on the disc, which I thought was really neat. Unfortunately, the article would only last for a couple of issues, and I was very happy doing it. The only issue was that the publisher, Live Publishing, was hitting financial issues at the time, and many of us never got paid for any of the articles towards the end and before the actual publisher collapsed. Unfortunately, I never got paid for a single article that was published, which was a massive, massive shame. Thankfully, another publisher would pick up the magazine, and Darren Jones would take over editing duties and still edits the magazine to this day. Martin Carroll would continue to write for the magazine, and even recently did a feature on the issue 19 that never was, and which was caught up in the collapse of Live Publishing. So that meant that the very last Games That Weren't feature that we did was also page set and ready to go. And here you can see that article for the very first time and how it was going to look. Now the content itself would eventually get reused and shown in Retro Survival, which was a special DVD produced in response to people not getting paid for their content. Here we can see Mailplane, which is done in a bit more detail compared to previous write-ups, and that's because it was a Vectrex special that was being done. As a result, there was also an interview with Mark Indictor, and then everything was kind of tied off and finished off with a short write-up on Clacks for the Atari 7800. So, although we didn't get paid for the features, it was still fun to do. I wasn't really doing it for the money. It was mainly just to kind of spread the word of the archive, and it was kind of cool to be able to write for a magazine. It's something I'd always dreamed of doing ever since I read Commodore format as a kid. Once it had finished and the magazine was picked up by another publisher, there was opportunity to do more articles. So I did one last one called Whatever Happened To, and did a feature on Mailplane in a bit more detail. But after that, I decided to kind of move on and focus purely on the website as a whole and not really do articles, because things were getting busy again and the website itself was starting to take up quite a lot of time as things picked up. So over the years, there's been many games found by Games That Weren't and are available to download in the archive in various different shapes and forms. There's far too many to mention here, but you can see many of the biggest findings that we have made for the Commodore 64 in this video reel. And the Commodore 64, of course, was the first machine that we'd focused on for many years, hence why we've just done this little segment in particular. But we will look at some of the findings on other platforms a little bit later. So many of the games you can actually see here started off just as simple screenshots in magazines, giving a glimpse of a game that was coming soon. Others, they began just simply as a rumour within a news column, but would end up being recovered as a full game. And there's quite a few cases where exactly that happened. Other times, you might occasionally get a developer turn up and just offer their work disc to preserve if you were really lucky. But what we found over the years has varied a lot. Sometimes we might just find a set of sprites or background assets, which doesn't sound like much or particularly exciting, but that might be all that exists of a particular game, and it still gives you a glimpse about how a game could have shaped up and what promise it may have had. If you're a little bit lucky, you may find a small prototype demo, which kind of gives you something playable that you can actually see in action, and often that kind of leads to more disappointment, because if the prototype's really good, then you might be more disappointed that it never got finished. Other times there might be just concept sketches or things like a music demo, for instance. But if you're really lucky, there might be a full game to find in some cases. Those full games, although they're complete and you can finish them, there might be sort of elements missing, such as sound effects or music, or there might be just a bit of lack of polish in places. Often it just depends on who is involved in those projects and how much of a hoarder those people were. Sadly, there are many that saw game development as just a day job and they just didn't keep hold of everything, and that's kind of fair enough, to be honest. However, you could get some companies where there are other workers who were hoarders and just kind of took home sneaky copies for themselves, and very often there's been cases where that's how we found some of the games, and not through the actual developers directly. So one of the things that's a lot of fun with the project is basically where you have to become almost a detective. So you're solving mysteries and you're trying to work out who has done what on a game, hoping that if you find them, it may actually lead to something being found, or kind of tell a bit more about the story behind that particular game. Because as well as the games themselves, you're trying to preserve the history behind them too, about how they were started, why they were cancelled, and any other details that tell that story about the game and what was planned for it. But additionally, you've also got the development team itself, and often development teams, they have various stories to tell. Some quite funny, some that you can't really share, and others which are quite sad, really. But it's telling those stories that are really important, and it's important to capture them because they often give you a bit of background behind the scenes, which will give you an indication about why that game was cancelled, or why that game may have came out badly, or maybe really good. So of course, some of these games were actually worked on for many months, possibly even years. So there's a lot of work that's been done that potentially could be lost. Of course, I mean, some of the games could be very poor, and you could perhaps see why they were cancelled, and the developer or artist involved may agree too. But however, there were actually unfortunate cases where they were just simply brilliant games that never saw the light of day, and there have been cases in the archive where we have found brilliant full games. And these often were just not released simply due to legal issues, a publisher collapse, or with the development team being unlucky for getting a publisher to sign up the game. But in those cases where we find something, we're hopefully giving opportunity for people to finally enjoy someone's hard work, so that it hasn't fully gone to waste. But crucially though, it's also about saving people's work for posterity and before the actual digital media that it's stored on completely deteriorates. As the years go on, the more that we start to back up and preserve in terms of tapes and discs, the more that we're finding it's starting to fail and just kind of fade away. There have been cases where discs have just completely disintegrated in drives and the data has just been completely lost as a result. So it's essentially a race against time all the time to try and find as much as we possibly can. But one of the things I would say is that if you do something like Games That Weren't, and do a project like this, you have to prepare for frustrations along the way. So one of the frustrations I've already mentioned is about the media itself, but also there can be many dead ends when you're doing your searches. And unfortunately, one of the things you'll find is that there'll always be titles that just get away as time goes on. You simply just cannot save everything. And there's many reasons for that. It could be simply that developers have kind of got rid of all their materials. They no longer have anything because they got rid of it years ago. In some sad cases, people have passed away because as time marches on, then we're all getting older too. However, work has to continue to try and recover whatever we can. And we just never know what's quite around the corner. It can be very easy to give up on certain titles when you think you've got to the end, but then something might just turn up and completely take you by surprise. That's been certainly the case with games like Daffy Duck and also Total Recall most recently, titles which at one point we thought, do you know what, we may not find these. So again, it has been a lot of fun recovering these titles over the years, and I really hope that you've enjoyed them too. Some have been a major slog to try and find, and some have taken many years to get any major breakthroughs, even just to get a single credit. But at the time of publication of this video and article, we have a grand total of 2,500 entries within the Commodore 64 archive alone. And that's a huge amount of writing when you think about it, and a scary amount. And just hopefully there's not too much terrible 16-year-old me level writing that's left in the archive these days. So as well as actually finding the games themselves, the other challenge was also trying to keep up the site design and keep it up to date and trying to evolve everything as the years went on. What you can see here in the background is how the site design would evolve from 2003 to present day. Not just with the design itself, but also behind the scenes too, and how it actually functioned. You see, the content was all done as flat HTML in a horrible template structure that I'd created, and which caused a lot of problems when I was trying to update the site on a regular basis. When I became a web developer in 2005, I was very keen to move everything to a database-driven site. Basically, this would kind of make everything so much easier to update, but would also potentially lead to new opportunities with navigation and other aspects to kind of make it a lot easier to use. So in 2006, I initially created the portal website to act just as an umbrella to all of our sub-archives, which were originally PC, 3DO, Amiga and Commodore 64. Only the Amiga and the 64 archives are now sadly running. I had wanted to merge in the 64 archive, but this was going to be no mean feat, so I kind of put it off for a little bit. So the idea of the initial site was just to kind of also share news from other unreleased games websites and the findings that they were making too at the time. In addition to this, we also had the opportunity to do posts about games for other platforms that were outside of our main archives, so titles for the Atari, Nintendo and Sega platforms, for instance. So eventually I got to work on merging in the 64 archive after kind of putting it off for quite a few years, and I'd have to end up writing many different scripts to try and scrape out the content and tidy up into a fresh new database format. So by 2012, that work was complete, and the process suddenly became a lot easier for adding new games. And what you'll see just in a moment is that site back in 2012, and that's exactly how it would look. Over time, we'd continue to evolve things, and we'd just try different ways to try and expose the data we were now storing and allow you to kind of discover the games in the archive in many different ways. Basically, over time, we'll just keep adding tweaks and improvements to try and make everything as easy as possible to navigate, and I hope that's what you've been finding so far. So whilst continuing to find games and also keep the site updated, we also started to do games that weren't exhibitions at the Play Expos, which were held at the likes of Manchester, Margate and Blackpool every year. So over the space of 5 years or so, I'd often do a stand next to the late and great Jason Kelk, who ran an old school gaming stand. And it was here that we showcased various unreleased games that we had found on the Commodore 64, but also games that were found by others for other platforms. Sadly, I no longer actually do the stands now, but they were a huge amount of fun at the time, and I really enjoyed being able to go into the venue before it opened and have a sneaky game on the arcade machines that they had set up, especially Speed Buggy, which I used to love playing to death. But it was also really lovely at these events to meet so many people that had helped over the years with the archive in person and be able to shake their hand, but to also meet other developers and people that had created games, and also people that were completely, who weren't in the games industry at all. And over the years, I'd make many different friends from these events. In the actual show that's being shown here in the photos, this was from 2012 and the very first show that we did. And it was here that most of the Ocean staff had turned up, and there was like a photo shoot and everything. And Steve Wahid actually turned up that day, and I almost managed to convince him to dig out his discs in the hope that we would recover Street Hawk, but sadly it just wasn't to be. It was around this same time in 2012 that I'd hit a point in my life where I felt that everything I was working on wasn't particularly permanent. I was slowly creeping towards 40, and I'd built sites for work that had a limited shelf life and then would just disappear for good. I basically wanted to do something physical for a change, and as a sort of a magnus opus in a way, a kind of way to leave a mark and say I was here in case I suddenly popped my clogs. So I had this crazy idea to write a book. It would take 8 years roughly to do everything during my spare time, but in 2020 the Games That Weren't Book was finally launched by Bitmap Books, complete with 644 pages and a bright green fluorescent ink used throughout. So hopefully this was going to be something that just popped out at you. So the idea is that I covered titles across all the different decades and also across many different platforms. And one of the main things I wanted to do is not just to regurgitate content from the website, but to create fresh new content and in a lot more detail too, with many interviews with those who had actually worked on the games and to kind of tell their story. I'd say it's possibly the hardest thing that I've ever done, and I didn't really realise just how much work it was going to be. And as a result, there were many, many late nights leading up to the launch. So before the launch, I actually had a lot of fears and sleepless nights that Sam was going to be left with a warehouse full of books. But instead, I've been incredibly humbled by the response over the past 4 years, and we are now well into our third print run. One of the things I've really loved is just seeing people post on social media when they've got their copies and the positive feedback that comes back as well. Just thank you so much, everyone, for all of your love and support during these years, and I'm just really chuffed to bits that you've enjoyed the book. I'd say one of the additional bonuses after the book was launched is that we would do regular bonus content posts on the site for a few months, so posting materials that didn't quite make the cut, but also it allowed us to kind of show videos of some of the games such as Stunt Car Racer and Dick Special for the first time, which obviously it's not possible to put a video in a physical book, only static screenshots. So we were able to kind of do more digital interactive stuff, which kind of extended the book a little bit and gave you something extra to get excited about, hopefully. So I hope you enjoyed that too. So one huge bonus of doing the book was that during the production we would end up recovering one of our greatest and biggest holy grail titles in the form of Daffy Duck by High-Tech Software. And this was a game that was due for release on the Commodore 64 back in 1992. So I decided to cover the game across all of its intended formats in the book and not just the Commodore 64 edition. And it was during the interview process with Ash and Dave about the C64 version that I'd asked Ash again about the chances of us ever being able to find it, just so we could get a quote to include in the book. And all I was expecting was Ash to come back and say again that unfortunately he wasn't able to find anything in the game and that he no longer had it. So I was very shocked when Ash actually turned around and said that he found all of his discs at the back of his attic. So straight away I quickly offered to digitally preserve all of them for him free of charge in the hope that we may find something of Daffy Duck. Ash wasn't so confident and he still felt there would be nothing to be found on there apart from just graphics, but at least that would be something. So I met up with Ash and Dave in Leamington Spa and I picked up a suitcase full of discs, but inside that suitcase and within those boxes was a box of PC discs that Dave had completely forgotten giving to Ash. That particular box contained all of his backed up PDS source code, including everything of Daffy Duck. And I still remember Dave turning to me at that point and saying that I'd hit the jackpot, and we most certainly did. And it's thanks to Martin Pugh that the game was reconstructed and finally released back in 2015, and to just such a great reception overall. It was such an amazing time. So as well as Daffy Duck, the book has also led to other recoveries along the way too. So one of those would be Green Lantern on the Super Nintendo. So this is a second prototype that was produced and didn't get very far at all. So although we've preserved the game, we've not been able to release it on the website. So for now we've just added a video so you can see the game in action. And hopefully someday in the future we will get permission to release it. Another huge bonus of the book was the recovery of very rare footage of Dick Special in action on the Commodore Amiga. So Dick Special was a very famous unreleased Amiga game that was being written by Sandy White, and it was thanks to Sandy and artist Alistair Hearsum that this video was recovered whilst we were doing the actual write-up on the game. So this video shows a later build from what was shown in the magazines, where Alistair has taken over the artwork and the game engine was dramatically changed by Sandy. Then we had a lot of materials and even a showreel provided for a game called Marsoc, an impressive third-person shooter strategy game which was in the style of the likes of Gears of War and Call of Duty. And it was a game that was being developed by Zombie Studios for the likes of the Xbox 360 and other platforms, but sadly would get dropped by its intended publisher and not picked up by anyone else. Eventually the game was kind of broken up and elements were used in various other games that Zombie Studios would produce. So as well as materials for the Commodore 64, we've also been showcasing and recovering assets for other platforms too. Here are more examples of some of those findings, which include like a PC version of Thrust that completely come out of the blue, but also a Game Boy Color edition of Putty Squad as well. One of the things I would say is that since the book and since the launch, we've had a lot more people coming forward with contributions and with the offer of trying to preserve their work. So hopefully there's a lot more to come, and we're also now starting to preserve a variety of different formats ourselves, buying equipment to help with this process and to try and back up as much as we possibly can. So like most recently I've been trying to get the right equipment to back up 3-inch Amstrad CPC and Spectrum discs, just so we can kind of add to the catalogue of the different formats that we can sort of preserve overall. So hopefully if people come to us in the future with various different obscure formats, then we'll be able to support them as best as we can. Then most recently in 2023, Games That Weren't has been tasked with possibly one of its biggest preservation projects so far, with the preservation of the late Arch McLean's work discs and materials. So the work for this is still ongoing, but in Christmas 2023 we revealed the revelation that Drop Zone had originally started out as almost official conversions of both Defender and Stargate for the Atari home computers. And we kind of put up prototype demos and video clips showing these early concepts and demos so you can actually play them for yourself. Then later on we looked at early arcade concepts that Archer had once started and never finished, including the conversion of Robotron. Some more details about our findings so far can be found on the website, and you can kind of track our process over time. Hopefully we should be finished with all the preservation work by sometime this summer. So after 25 years of Games That Weren't, what is next for us? Well, firstly, we're just going to keep having fun and doing what we're doing in the hope that we can save many more games, assets and history before it's too late. One thing that I want to mention is that although we will try our utmost best to keep updating the site, unfortunately time is always going to be a limited resource. As like with many other people, these days I have care and responsibilities with my elderly parents, and this in particular includes my dad, who unfortunately has deteriorated a lot over the last 5 or 6 years. So in a strange way, and in many ways, Games That Weren't has actually been a huge refuge for me as a result when times get particularly tough. But I will always try and be open and honest with everyone who contributes, and I hope that no one is too frustrated with how quickly I can get the updates out there. Of course, if there's a billionaire who would like to kind of employ me full time to do the site, then please do get in touch. But joking aside, I really do hope that you've enjoyed the ride so far, and hope that you can still continue it with us for the next 25 years. It just leaves me to say a huge thank you to everyone who has contributed over the years, and to all my friends and family, especially Vinny, who have given so much encouragement and support. It's basically all of you that have made many of the recoveries and the preservation efforts possible. So you should all be proud, and just thank you so much. So hope to speak to you soon, hopefully with the next big finding. So take care and speak to you soon.